Okay, chapters 20 and 21. Let's jump right in. When Pip arrives in London, this is now part 2 of the novel. I don't know why they didn't divide it that way here. There's a part 2 here, but anyway. When Pip arrives in London, he first goes to Jagger's grimy, dismal office in Little Britain, decorated with 2 dreadful cases on a shelf of fancy faces peculiarly swollen and twitchy about the nose. 2 dreadful cases on a shelf. What does that even mean? Wemmick is Jagger's clerk, shows Pip in as Jaggers is in court. Pip wanders through the smutty, bloody Smithfield meat market, then to Newgate prison area. The drunken minister of justice shows Pip the public gallows, whipping posts, and debtor's door. He tries to sell Pip a spectator seat at a trial. During the Victorian era, prisons in London were infamously dirty and disorderly, overrun with lower-class prisoners, frequently debtors, who were dehumanized with inhumane condition. When Mr. Jaggers returns, he sends away his poor, miserable clients, whom he treats with contempt, after making sure they've paid Wemmick. He is a middle-class lawyer who controls many lower-class people, and treats them with disdain. He seems to care little for the lives or stories of his clients, as he is interested only in their money. Jaggers informs Pip of his allowance, and that he will stay with Matthew Pocket's son at Bernard's Inn. He tells Pip he will carefully watch his spending, and he is sure Pip will go wrong somehow. Because, of course, Pip is low class, and he hates low-class people. Who was Matthew Pocket again? There's a lot of names flying in the face here. I'm not sure who's who. Pocket. Sarah Pocket is right here. So Matthew Pocket is Herbert Pocket is the pale young gentleman. Oh, the pale young gentleman was Herbert Pocket. That's who we got. Pip first meets him in Miss Havisham's when the two have a fist fight. They later live together in London and become best friends. Herbert is kind, unassuming, and loyal to Pip. Matthew Pocket, Herbert's father and Pip's tutor. He is intellectual but ineffectual in controlling his wife's household. He is Miss Havisham's relative but is not interested in her money. Okay. So he will stay with Matthew Pocket's son. Okay. And then he finds out, oh, that's the guy I had a fist fight with. And now you have to live with him. That's awkward. Okay, Dickens takes advantage of similes, letting us better understand the characters several times in this chapter to reinforce his descriptions. He compares the skylight of Mr. Jaggers' room to a broken head, and his high-backed chair to a coffin. Then Dickens compares a man pulling back a lock of hair in the middle of his forehead while talking to Mr. Jaggers to a bull in Cock Robin pulling at the bell rope. That's capitalized. That must be a place. He also uses parallelism to drive home a point, to emphasize the fact that Pip wonders quite a bit while in Mr. Jaggers' office. Dickens repeats this verb several times in this passage. I wondered how many other clerks there were upstairs, and whether they all claimed to have the same detrimental mastery of their fellow creatures. I wondered what was the history of all the odd litter about the room, and how it came there. I wondered whether the 2 swollen faces were of Mr. Jaggers' family, and, if he were so unfortunate as to have a pair of such ill-looking relations, why he stuck them on that dusty perch for the blacks and flies to settle on to, instead of giving them a place at home. Of course, I had no experience of a London summer day, and my spirits may have been oppressed by the hot, exhausted air, by the dust and grit that lay thick on everything, but I sat wondering and waiting in Mr. Jaggers' closed room until I really could not bear the 2 casts on the shelf above Mr. Jaggers' chair. Slurred that. Mr. Jaggers' chair, and got up and went out. Okay, so I think the 2 faces they referenced up here, 2 dreadful cases on a shelf, I think they're like busts, little statues of family members. Okay. Dickens repeats this use of parallelism when Pip reports that Mr. Jaggers had said with the impassive construction, "I was too." I was to remain with young Mr. Pocket until Monday. On Monday I was to go with him to his father's house on a visit, that I might try how I liked it. Also I was told that my allowance was to be. It was a very liberal one, or what my allowance was to be. It was a very liberal one, and had handed to me from one of my guardian's drawers the cards of certain tradesmen with whom I was to deal with all kinds of clothes, such other things as I could in reason want. Finally, Dickens uses foreshadowing to let us form an idea of Mr. Jaggers before he speaks to Pip. The coachman who drops Pip off at the office got away, which appeared to relieve his mind, as quickly as possible. Later, as he waits, he overhears what the others have to say about Mr. Jaggers. Oh, this will be interesting. There were two men of secret appearance. Secret appearance. Yes, they got hats covering their faces or something. Lounging in Bartholomew Close and thoughtfully fitting their feet into the cracks of the pavement as they talked together, one of whom said to the other, when they first passed me, that Jaggers would do it if it were to be done. There was a knot of 3 men and 2 women standing at a corner, and one of the women was crying on her dirty shawl. And the other comforted her by saying, as she pulled her own shawl over her shoulders, "Jaggers is for him, Melia, and what more could you have?" There was a red-eyed little Jew, I don't like that, who came into the close while I was loitering there, in company with a second little Jew whom he had sent upon an errand, and while the messenger was gone, I remarked this Jew, who was of a highly excitable temperament, performing a jig of anxiety under a lamp-post and accompanying himself in a kind of frenzy with the words, "Oh, Jaggerth, 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 all a thirth I Cagmagirth, give me Jaggerth," whatever that means. These testimonies to the popularity of my guardian made a deep impression on me, and I admired and wondered more than ever. So this is people depending on Jaggers. They think Jaggers is really going to fight for them, is really going to go to bat for them. They don't know that he doesn't care about them at all. Okay, chapter 21. Wemmick takes Pip to his quarters at Bernard's Inn, while Pip observes the other man's features, which he calls wooden. He is a rigid professional. They discuss crime in London, and Wemmick helps Pip understand that some crime is committed for profit rather than revenge, which Pip considers even worse than the crime committed for an emotional reason, because he cares about money so much. When Mr. Pocket Jr. arrives to let Pip in, he carries two paper bags and a container of strawberries. He and Pip enter the apartment and recognize each other as the prowling boy and the pale young gentleman who sparred at Saddis House years ago. Yeah. They're like, "Wait a second, didn't I fight you once for no reason?" "Yeah, that was me. You won, didn't you?" "Yeah, let's be friends." The inn turns out to be an assortment of shabby buildings surrounding a courtyard Pip describes as a melancholy little square that looked to me like a flat burying ground. Pip is disappointed, his expectations of grander living quarters unmet. Just as Saddis House represents the misery and warped perspective of Miss Havisham, the inn mirrors Pip's dishonorable social motivations. Exercise. Early days in London. So this is why this part is part 2 of the novel, because it takes place in London. He'll go back and revisit Kent at another point, but his home base is now London. People, places, and scenarios bring out the best or worst in a person. What are Pip's expectations as he arrives in London? What balances his expectations? Reality. Reality balances his expectations. What new events challenge Pip's expectations? That he has to live with the guy he beat up? How does Pip respond to these challenges? Condescension. Okay. I'm going to have to take a break after this. The two men are astounded at meeting one another again so many years later, and Herbert, Mr. Pocket Jr., explains that he was taken to Miss Havisham as a potential suitor for Estella, although the old woman rejected him. He confirms that Jaggers is Miss Havisham's lawyer and confidant. Pip likes Herbert's open, kind demeanor. He asks Herbert to correct his table manners and introduces himself as Philip, a breach of his benefactor's terms as he tries to escape his lower-class past and his own identity. Over dinner, Herbert reveals Miss Havisham's history. The spoiled child of a wealthy brewer whose father died, leaving her an inheritance and her half-brother, whose mother was presumably lower class, a small sum. She fell in love with a man she idolized, a man who convinced her to buy her half-brother's share of the brewery, why is that so hard to say, brewery, for a large sum. On the day of their wedding, the man sent Miss Havisham a letter stating that he wouldn't marry her, and she stopped all of her clocks at 20 to 9 and became a hermit. By explaining Miss Havisham's heartbreak, Herbert provides Pip more understanding and motivation for her eccentric behavior. Pip now understands that she groomed Estella to wreak revenge on all of the male sex, including him. This does little to deter his desire to win over Estella. Herbert's father, Matthew, a relative, had warned Miss Havisham about the man. Herbert's father, Matthew, right, Matthew Pocket, had warned Miss Havisham about the guy who left her at the altar. Okay, Matthew Pocket had warned Miss Havisham about the guy who left her at the altar, which angered her, and she sent Matthew away, never to see him again. So that's why Matthew's not after her money. He's actually interested. There's another thing. Matthew Pocket is actually interested in Miss Havisham's well-being. Herbert reveals that the suspicion that Miss Havisham's fiancé and her half-brother may have conspired against her, the result of a class conflict. Miss Havisham had a higher status than her brother, since she was born into an upper-class marriage. Herbert explains he hopes to become a capitalist, an insurer of ships, although he is currently looking for work. This is a reflection on the industrialization of England at the time, where you can make money by just being an insurance broker. The next day, Herbert takes Pip to his father's house, where he meets Mrs. Matthew Pocket, her maids, and many children who are tumbling up, as Mrs. Pocket reads a book to herself and ignores them. Okay, one of the many Gothic themes is that of tangled family relationships, and Dickens puts this on full display when Herbert describes the following scrambled relationship. He was so obliging as to suggest my father for your tutor, and he called on my father to propose it. Of course, he knew about my father from his connection with Miss Havisham. My father is Miss Havisham's cousin. Not that implies familiar intercourse between them, for he is a bad courtier and will not propitiate her. Oh, boy, that's a lot of... Okay. Real quick. Propitiate? Win or regain the favor of by doing something that pleases them. Okay. Who's the he in this sentence? Jaggers? Jaggers suggests Matthew Pocket because he's Miss Havisham's cousin. Even though they're not friendly, and they're not going to be friendly. Dickens also continues his main theme of the idea of great expectations, and the differences between the classes when Pip tells us about Herbert. There was something wonderfully hopeful about his general air, and something that at the same time whispered to me he would never be successful or rich. And he offers Herbert's view of great expectations. I shall not rest satisfied with merely employing my capital in insuring ships. I shall buy up some good life assurance shares, and cut into the direction. What does that mean? I shall also do a little in a mining way. None of these things will interfere with my chartering a few thousand tons of my own account. I think I shall trade, said he, leaning back in his chair, to the East Indies, for silks, shawls, spices, dyes, drugs, and precious woods. It's an interesting trade. And the profits are large, said I. Tremendous, said he. I wavered again, and began to think here were greater expectations than my own. Finally, in his classic style, Dickens uses parallelism by repeating the passive voice construction. The marriage day was fixed, the wedding dresses were bought, the wedding tour was planned out, the wedding guests were invited. That's passive voice. Active voice would have said they planned the wedding, they bought the dresses, they planned out the tour, and they invited the guests. That's active voice. Passive voice is to do it backwards. Okay, 23 and 24, and then we're done. So, well, not done, but I'll take a break. This is getting harder and harder to speak. Chapter 23. Pip meets Matthew Pocket and learns more about Mrs. Pocket. She is the daughter of a late knight who was as proud of his title as he was poor. Really? He was a knight and he was poor? That's odd. He ordered that his daughter be raised with no domestic skills and that she marry nobility. She was raised to value a birthright, which is ironic since her father was poor. But Victorian England of Dickens' time had moved past the heredity class system. When she eloped with Matthew, her father had no dowry to give besides his blessing. She is pitied because she didn't in fact marry a title. Note the phrasing of marrying a title itself, not a man with a title. But it's Matthew Pocket who carries the blame for never giving the title he sought. Never getting the title he sought, becoming a bishop or member of parliament. Pip meets Startop and Bentley Drummle. I have never heard Startop. Who's Startop? One of the young gentlemen being tutored by Mr. Pocket. He later helps rescue Pip and help. Okay. So many names. Bentley Drummle, a baron-to-be with a superior attitude toward everyone in the home except Mrs. Pocket. Another example of a character who values social standing over the actual relationship. Pip exceedingly falls into this category of character, desiring above all to fit into the upper class to gain Estella's approval. Pip notes that the servants in the Pocket home have more authority than the Pockets themselves, due in large part to Mrs. Pocket dysfunction and ineptitude. Her own daughter, Jane, is a better mother to her siblings, and Mr. Pocket realizes his wife's incompetence, but can do nothing but pull at his hair in frustration. Mrs. Pocket reveals that the book she was reading was on titles, showing her concern for her own social status over the well-being of her children. After dinner, Drummle and Startop go rowing, a sport for the higher class, and Pip hires a trainer to teach him. He is offended when the trainer praises his physique as the strong arms of a blacksmith. He doesn't want to be associated with his former working-class trade. It's very silly. He's a silly boy. Dickens continues to depict the middle class through satire. Mrs. Pocket is a ridiculously incompetent caricature, insisting on being treated as nobility, although she isn't, in fact, noble. Chapter 24. Pip isn't intended to be educated for a profession, but rather as a gentleman, a man of wealth. So he's not being trained for any one particular job, he's being trained at how to be fancy. He responds to Mr. Pocket's passion for teaching by becoming an enthusiastic student. Pip wants to stay with Herbert at the inn and goes to Mr. Jaggers for money to buy furniture. Okay. Pip is grilled by Jaggers, who eventually gives him £20 to buy furniture. Pip is on the receiving end of Jaggers' intimidating nature for the first time. Mr. Wemmick shows Pip around Jaggers' office. Wemmick is Jaggers' assistant. Mr. Wemmick shows Pip around Jaggers' office, explaining the casts. Each one was taken after a man was hanged for a crime? Whoa. So that's why they're so puffy. They're dead men. The law office seems to be focused on profit from the criminals it represents, rather than justice. Wemmick invites Pip to his home and mysteriously warns Pip that if he ever visits Jaggers' home, he should look out for the housekeeper. Next, Pip visits police court, where Pip sees Jaggers in court in a cross-examination, dominating everyone in the room, including the judge. So Jaggers is actually a very intimidating person when he wants to be. Okay. In this chapter, Dickens livens up his style. Mr. Jaggers never laughed, but he wore great bright creaking boots, and, in poising himself on those boots, with his large head bent down and his eyebrows joined together, awaiting an answer, he sometimes caused the boots to creak, as if they laughed in a dry and suspicious way. Here he uses personification by giving a pair of inanimate boots lifelike qualities. In the next sentence, he again uses personification with the black marks on the wall. The house was dark and shabby, and the greasy shoulders that had left their mark in Mr. Jaggers's room seemed to have been shuffling up and down the staircase for years. He also re-employs the use of metaphor by directly comparing two things. In this case, London and a swimming pool. We dived into the city and came up in a crowded police court. Okay. So imperfect was this realization of the first of my great expectations that I looked in dismay at Mr. Wemmick. "Ah," said he, mistaking me, "the retirement reminds you of the country. So it does me." What great expectations is Pip referring to here? The money he's getting and his expectations to become a gentleman. How does Dickens portray Pip's disappointment with these expectations? Uh, have you ever heard of the grass is greener on the other side? You're in a pasture and there's a fence, and on the other side of the pasture, the grass looks greener. So you jump the fence, and now this grass is normal, and the grass on the back on the other side looks greener now. So you jump, and now this grass is normal, and the other grass looks greener. The grass is always greener on the other side, right? It basically means if you build up your expectations, nothing will ever be good enough for you. That's what Pip is suffering from right now. He keeps imagining things before they happen, and he builds them up so big that when reality comes, he's disappointed.